I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this should be one of the more interesting comparisons that we do in 2020, because over my right shoulder is the new Mazda BT-50, and over my left shoulder is the car that the BT-50 chose to divorce from its new generation. Underneath this Mazda ute, there is fundamentally an Isuzu D-Max this time around. D-Max engine, D-Max chassis. In fact, the only thing Mazda touched was the styling outside and a little bit inside. Whereas the Ford Ranger, seen here in PX Mark III Wildtrak guise, continues on with the same fundamental chassis that the BT-50 used to be based on. However, the Ranger has had so many upgrades that the Mazda BT-50 missed out on in its previous gen. But the point I'm coming to is, which is better? Was Mazda smart to kick Ford out of bed when it came to their new utility and shack up with Isuzu, or a Ford right to stay the course on the sort of ute they've developed with the Ranger? How much better does the next Ranger have to be, or is this one still faring pretty well? Well, in today's comparison, we're going to find out. We're going to check out the interiors of these two pretty nicely specified utes. We've got a Wildtrak and a GT. Both are pushing 70 grand by the time the wheels hit the road. Then we'll check out the trays and how much you can stick into these utilities before taking them on and off road to find out which is the winner in today's contest. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video. You access the BT-50 GT through a more old school proximity entry system with the same button on the door handle for lock and unlock, but that's pretty slim pickings in terms of criticism, and it's nice to have the feature in the first place, and it lets you into this cabin, which is a good improvement from the previous BT-50. That doesn't mean that the Ranger is crap, because the Ranger just got a better interior as time went on, and Mazda didn't really upgrade the BT-50 to the same level, so that means that this new generation has sort of leapfrogged where the outgoing BT-50 was at, if that makes sense, and nowhere more so than in this GT, which really does have all the trimmings, starting with quite supple brown leather seats. Now, the cloth seats in the mid-spec XTR are really comfortable and probably better for summer in that they're not going to heat up, but if you are after a dual cab which feels a little bit special inside, then these brown leather pews in the GT are where it's at. They're really supple, supportive and comfortable, a nice seat with a good range of adjustment for the driver with power adjustment as well. Now, this steering wheel, it's kind of funny because these shortcut buttons, they look like the old Ranger based BT-50, which is really unusual because this car has nothing to do with that. But one thing this steering wheel does have going for it is that it actually has both reach and rake adjustment, unlike the Ranger, which is still only rake, which is unusual. Plus, it's a bit of a smaller wheel, feels a bit more car-like. The leather's a slightly higher grade too. Now, some of the materials in the BT-50 are also better. Like down here against the center console, we have soft pads, which means you're not going to be kind of banging so hard against this thing on a long trip. And we do have sort of stitched leatherette material up here, but it doesn't feel quite as deep or as nice as in the Ranger. And in fact, the interior as a whole, perceived quality just isn't quite at the same level as the Ford. The Ford feels really, really well stitched together and very cohesive. The Mazda is pretty good, and so is the Isuzu D-Max that it's based on, just not quite hitting the same highs. What is good though is the new tech. We have a large, crisp 9-inch touchscreen here, which is capable of doing wireless Apple CarPlay and wired Android Auto, so that's certainly a big step for this segment in terms of connectivity, but the graphics on the integrated software are not as good as on the Ford. They're pretty basic, and the software is a lot less clear to use, so it's still a win for the Ford Sync system. Similarly, the gauges aren't quite as comprehensive on the BT-50. They're analog for the tach and the speedometer, that's fine. The trip computer in between though is a little more old school, a bit dated looking compared to the twin setup in the Ranger. In terms of practicality, it's pretty line ball, 2 big cup holders between the seats, a tray ahead of the shifter here. We have one USB port up front, just like in the Ford. And the center bin perhaps isn't quite as deep, but there is a bit more space for bottles in the doors. So all in all, not a huge amount in it. Bit of extra practicality here in terms of an upper glove box, I will say, but it's a bit of a taste thing, whether you like the look of this or the Ranger, but I would say the quality up front in the Ranger is a little better still. What about backseat space in the Mazda? Well, let's head there. Here in the back of the BT-50, a few things are immediately noticeable. The first is that they didn't forget to include air vents, which is really critical in a hot country like Australia. It's already starting to get pretty hot at this point of the year. So air vents are really great to see, helping to keep the airflow going. So if you've got kids, you'll really want to opt for something like this where they're not left feeling too hot in the second row. Plus, there's another powered USB port here in the second row, unlike in the Ranger. So that's just a nice modern inclusion there. But in other ways, they're quite similar. So for myself at 6 foot, headroom, I've got another couple of inches in the Mazda, maybe slightly less. Legroom is good, and tow room is also fair. The middle seat is probably a touch more usable because it's slightly less of a perch, but it's still not going to be a very comfortable seat. Now, the seat base isn't as good as in the Ford Ranger. As you can see, it's just not as inclined, so your legs kind of float. And that's the sort of thing which becomes a bit tiresome after a couple of hours sitting in the back seat of a car. That being said, we do have a couple of extra tricks. The first being that the BT-50 seats actually go up, so that if you need to carry a taller load, there's a bit more flexibility. And we have a 4 kilo rated hook on the back of the passenger seat. Like the Ford, we do have a flip down armrest with cup holders, all of which kind of goes to Mazda's point that they're hoping to lure in some SUV buyers with the new BT-50, so they have kind of chocked it full of family-friendly features here in the back seat. The experience of jumping into the Ranger Wildtrak starts better because it has a more sophisticated proximity entry system where the pad to unlock the door is located behind the handle rather than on the front with a button. It's a small thing, but it really hints at the fact that the Ford Ranger feels like it has so many small details nailed down. This is a really cohesive package, and even though it is a little bit dated now in terms of the look of some of the parts of the interior, you never kind of go, oh, this feels a bit cobbled together or a bit random. Out of the two cars here, the Ford Ranger really makes sense in terms of how cohesive the cabin and the technology is. And I think that is a testament to the fact they did it right the first time in this car. Of course, the updates to this generation of Ranger have really helped. And now that we're at the Mark III point, it's got plenty of modern technology. And that starts with this touchscreen here. It's not as big as the one in the Mazda. It's only 8 inches and it feels a little small now in 2020, but it works well. The software is sophisticated and mature to look at. The graphics are certainly better, and I think it's a lot more intuitive to navigate. It runs Ford's Sync 3 system. There are really big targets on screen, and the graphics just look a bit tidier and a bit better. We have wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so not wireless. Certainly more difficult to use Android Auto or Apple CarPlay without the wireless function that you get in the BT-50. So that is something to keep in mind. But the speakers do sound pretty good here in the Ranger. And you do have Siri eyes free, so you can kind of still use some of the functions of your phone wirelessly that way. We look forward onto mixed analog and digital gauges, which were a bit of a Ranger hallmark at this point. We have an analog speedo in the center, but 2 customizable and very customizable screens to either side of that. So you can see your navigation directions, your trip computer, or a representation of a tachometer, audio stuff. You can really set this ute up to how you want it, and that's all driven by these shortcut keys on the steering wheel, of which there are many. So there's a bit of a learning curve to mastering the Ranger, but it has a more powerful back end to all of this hardware, and you can do more with it. We do have physical controls for the climate down here. They're a bit more pokey than the toggles on the BT-50, but always nice to have. Now, what are we sitting on? Pretty comfortable seats, to be honest. Quite shapely, but they're not too narrow, so I think most body sizes are going to fit in this thing. The orange accents on the Wildtrak seats and also up here on the stitched dash are pretty cool. They certainly give the cabin a bit of a lift, and there's also a fair amount of electric adjustment in the driver's seat, so I think most people are going to be able to find a good driving position. In terms of practicality, we have large cup holders here between the seats, a decent bin ahead of the shifter, and the low range transfer case controls here with 1 USB port, a storage box between the seats which is dual level and quite deep as well, and decent sized door bins as well. So all in all, it's a cabin that has dated pretty well in my opinion. Let's check out the back seats next. Accommodation here in the back seat of the Ranger is pretty generous, if I'm honest. Most dual cabs are fairly uncomfortable and tight in the back seat, and it's hardly palatial here, but sitting behind my own driving position, I have a good amount of room. I'm 6 foot and my headroom is good. Got another several inches there. Legroom is no problem, and tow room is fair. Not the best I've seen, but certainly fine. The middle seat is usable just. There is a bit of a hump in the floor, and it is a perch, but you could squeeze a fifth person in if you really had to. But I think max it out at 4 and this ute will be pretty comfortable, particularly because the seat base is inclined upwards and the backrest isn't too upright. So you could actually do a bit longer in the back of this thing than in the BT-50, I'm thinking. That being said, there is one big fail, and that's the lack of air vents in the back of the Ranger. In a hot country like Australia, and particularly given Australia contributed the most to the development of this Ford Ranger, you'd think that that would have been ticked off, and it hasn't been added, unfortunately. But we do have some good stuff. We have a 12-volt socket, and more importantly, we have a 230-volt household power point, which is one of the great features for a car like this in Australia, and very, very useful. Now, just like up front, most of the trims are hard, but we do have a little bit of soft insert here in the door, so you have something to lean on, plus a flip-down armrest with a pair of cup holders, so it does a fairly good impression of an SUV in the back. Just a shame about that airflow. Here around the back of the Ford Ranger, it's still a pretty good looking ute in my opinion, although this orange colour seems to be a bit of a love it or hate it thing. Personally, I like it, goes well with the sticker package you get on the Wildtrak. Plus, we have a tailgate that is actually damped here on the Ranger, a rare feature in this segment. Usually they slam open if you drop them by accident, much like in the BT-50. And we have a little party trick of the Ford Ranger here, the standard power operated tonneau cover on the tray, which is certainly quite handy, although you do have to wonder a little bit about the durability of parts like that. That being said, the tray is fairly standard here in the Ranger, but you are going to notice a couple of deficiencies compared to the Mazda. Namely, it's 16 centimeters narrower in terms of the opening to the tray, and the length of the tray is also 12 centimeters shorter, but by all other metrics, it's about the same, 500 mil high, and the width between the arches, or this rearward portion here outside of the arch constraint, is exactly the same as the BT-50, and we do measure these things to make sure that you're getting an accurate result. As you can see, we have a bed liner here in the tray, so you're not going to be damaging that orange paintwork. It is also worth talking about here that because the Ranger is a bit heftier than the new BT-50, your payload does suffer. It's just under 1,000 kilos in the Ford compared to about 1,065 kilos in the Mazda. So by saving a little bit of weight on the actual vehicle of the new BT-50, Mazda have managed to put that vehicle ahead in terms of what you can carry. And on that note, we'll jump over to that car and check out the tray. I've mentioned some of the Mazda's benefits in terms of payload because this is a lighter ute, plus the tray is actually a little bit bigger, but in other ways the BT-50 suffers in comparison to the Ranger. Firstly, if you lose your grip on this tailgate, it isn't damped at all, so it is going to slam open. The second thing is that you can see, even though we have the top spec BT-50 GT here, which is about $2,000 cheaper than a Ranger Wildtrak 2-litre, there's no tray liner, there's no sports bar, there's certainly no power retracting tonneau cover here. So even though you are saving a bit of money by going for the BT-50, if you want to spec it up with a couple of cool features back here at the rear end, you're going to be at the same price as the Ranger or beyond. So even though Mazda has partnered with ARB and a number of other suppliers to generate a really long list, over 100 locally developed accessories for the BT-50, which is cool. I mean, you do have to pay for them, and that is going to drive the price of this ute over 70 grand and further, depending on how far you go with accessorizing. But in terms of the tray, first thing that's great is that it's considerably wider in terms of the opening compared to the Ranger. We have an extra 16 centimeters here, tray's 12 centimeters longer, so you're just going to fit more stuff in the back of the BT-50. Same width as the tray in the Ranger and same height as I mentioned, but in terms of the extra space and just the maneuverability in here, it is going to be a touch better. And as I mentioned in my standalone review of the BT-50 XTR, I moved flats with this vehicle and it made it really easy. Can't say I've done the same for the Ranger, but I'm sure I would have worked that out as well. So it really is a bit of a game of compromise between these two, whether you want the trickery and the power adjustable features there in the Ranger's tray, or if you want something a little bit bigger, but more Spartan. Of course, the big contest is how these things drive, and that's where we're going to head next. So what's the new BT-50 like to drive when chucked into a comparison against its old brother, the Ford Ranger? Well, Obviously, it's not going to surprise you that there are now stark differences in the driving experience between these two utes. And in some ways, the BT-50 is better, and in other ways, it's worse. And I'm going to run through those things right now. The first way that the BT-50 takes a little step back is that it actually drops in power and torque compared to the old version, which used the Ranger's 3.2 litre 5-cylinder turbo diesel engine. The BT-50 never got the Ranger's new 2 litre bi-turbo 4-cylinder unit, but still, the old engine made 147 kilowatts and 470 newton meters. The new Isuzu-sourced 3 litre diesel 4-cylinder makes 140 kilowatts of power and 450 newton meters of torque. So we're certainly not talking about night and day here, nor is this ute that slow or sluggish. It's just a little bit less power and a little bit less torque, but also less weight. So the power to weight ratio drop isn't as dramatic as what you might expect. And I would actually say the BT-50's throttle tip-in is a little more aggressive. That's the way they've tuned it. So it feels line ball off the line compared to the Ranger, even if the Ford is going to leave it behind eventually, surfing on its wave of stronger power and torque, particularly if you go for the 2 litre Ranger, which is beefier than the 5-cylinder in both of those regards. Now, the Mazda is actually a little more economical in the real world. We found it used about 8.5 litres per 100 Ks, so a little less thirsty, 10-15% less thirsty than the Ranger 2 litre in the real world, and that's probably a weight thing. Now, the thing that you'll really tell in terms of a difference between the new BT-50 and the Ranger is that the Ranger is just so much more settled in terms of road driving. You can probably hear a bit more of a waver in my voice here in the BT-50, and that's just because this chassis has more of that classic body-on-frame shudder than what you find in the Ranger, where Ford have managed to really kind of tune that out now. And it's not a case of that the Ranger is like brand new and the BT-50 has lots of Ks on it. In fact, it's fairly inverse. This BT-50 has a couple of thousand Ks on it. The Ranger has 9,000 Ks, but I can tell it's been quite a tough 9,000 Ks because there's a few squeaks in that car. So I think my colleagues have been having a good time. But point being, even this box fresh BT-50 is less comfortable and the springs feel like they've got more work to do. So if you're coming from a more traditional ute, or you're upgrading from, say, a D-Max because you want the same engine effectively but in a nicer Mazda style body, then this is going to be fine. And in fact, it is a significant improvement over the old D-Max. The ride and handling of the new D-Max and the BT-50 is a big step forward when compared to the Isuzu lineage. However, the BT-50 is more appropriately compared to the old BT-50, which of course was on the Ford family tree. And when you look at it like that, it's still a step forward because the BT-50 didn't get the same sorts of upgrades over its lifetime that the Ranger did, so we can't pretend like the old BT-50 is just like this orange Ranger Wildtrak Mark III on test today, because it wasn't. It's just that, you know, it doesn't overtake the Ranger in terms of driving dynamics. It just doesn't. The steering has a bigger dead spot, it feels more trucky, less natural. It still tracks a really good line through the corners, it's still quite confidence-inducing for a dual cab, body control's pretty good, and the ride quality is on the good side for this segment. It's just not as comfortable as the Ford Ranger. Like the Ranger, it has rear drum brakes, which I know give you a good handbrake off-road, but that is really the marginal case these days given how many people are using these vehicles on-road, and you really want the braking performance instead of, you know, the slimmer benefits of the drum brake. At least that's my opinion. You are welcome to disagree with me down below in the comments. But there's one area where the BT-50 definitely has the edge, and that's in the amount of safety technology that doesn't just come with the BT-50, but in fact it's fitted as standard. And that includes autonomous emergency braking that detects people, cyclists, other cars, and also oncoming cars at junctions. It has junction AEB, which is a brand new type of technology. It has a center airbag. It has active lane keep assist. It has blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, traffic sign recognition. The Ranger has some of these features, but the safety suite just isn't as comprehensive as the BT-50. So the fact it has all that stuff is good. This tech can be life-saving, The problem is that the tuning of some of these technologies lacks polish. So unlike the Ranger, which has a less active lane keeping system, but it prompts you in a reasonable way with a shudder of the steering wheel that only the driver will know about, and you will know about it, the BT-50 instead shrieks to the whole cabin when it senses a lane departure, when its forward collision warning, which is oversensitive, detects a car closing in gradually in front. And these systems tend to be so shrill that I worry people will tune out. And so just the having of the systems is obviously important. We obviously give it credit, but I do want to make the point that the tuning of the systems in a way that works with the driver and educates the driver in a more subtle way help a lot more than just installing a loud beep, which I think you start to resent. But once again, I'm keen for your feedback on that line of thought, so pop it down below in the comments. So what is the Ford Ranger like to drive, at least in this comparison, up against the new BT-50, which has divorced the Ranger platform probably for good? Well, despite being a pretty old ute now, at least 5 years old in terms of its time on the market, and more than that since it was developed, the PX Ranger is doing really well. It's dating well, arguably dating better than the Volkswagen Amarok, even though I think the Amarok still has the edge in terms of powertrains by offering a 3-litre V6 that's really creamy and torquey. The Ranger's choices of powertrains are pretty good, and the rest of the ute has been kept up to speed better than vehicles like the Amarok. And what that ends up meaning is that even though the BT-50 is brand new, and so too is the D-Max that it's based on, the Ranger doesn't feel dated or old-fashioned by comparison. Instead, they honestly feel like utes that could have been developed at the same time, which I think is a big shock. But first of all, there's a choice under the bonnet of the Ranger that you don't get in the D-Max, and that's that you can choose between 3 engines. There's a small 2.2-litre 4-cylinder in the base cars, but today we're really talking about the more desirable upper spec versions. So there's effectively 2 engines. A more traditional 3.2-litre 5-cylinder turbo diesel making 147 kilowatts of power and 470 newton meters of torque, or this newer 2-litre twin-turbo diesel 4-cylinder which makes 157 kilowatts of power and 500 newton meters of torque, courtesy of that bi-turbo setup as this ute is badged. And as such, it's really quite torquey. It's more than 10% torquier than the BT-50, and it certainly gets along well on the road, though I wouldn't say that it feels it's perhaps 50 newton meters torquier than the Mazda, though that's likely to be a product of the fact that as well as being more powerful and more torquey, it's also considerably heavier. The Ranger is about 150 kilos heavier than the BT-50, and while we're talking about 2 cars that both weigh over 2 tons, that is a difference that you'll be able to feel, and of course it does impact payload, as I've already mentioned. That being said, the Ranger's additional weight does help it in certain ways. For starters, it just feels more planted on the road than the BT-50. And that's a product of both weight, but also the expert tuning of the Ranger's suspension. This vehicle is largely an Australian development, and you can tell because it feels very well suited to Australian roads. And it's been updated as time has gone on as well, so it hasn't just stayed the same throughout its lifespan, which was pretty much the issue with the outgoing BT-50. So the suspension is so much more compliant than you'd expect from a dual cab. It's, I would say, the most car-like of the dual cab utes in terms of how it rides. There's almost no shudder from the rear end, which is the main characteristic of a dual cab ute, or really just a frame vehicle. When you drive over a bump, you feel this shimmy. It's still there in the Ranger, but it's really minimal. So much so that if you jumped into this from an SUV, you wouldn't really have much of an adjustment period. Similarly, the steering has more heft and weight to it than most vehicles in this segment, and as such it feels quite natural, quite easy to get used to, and I find it quite simple to plot a line through a corner in the Ford Ranger. We only have Bridgestone Jeweler highway terrain tyres here, so it's not like it gets a performance tyre or anything like a Volkswagen Amarok Ultimate, but that does give you a decent blend of a tyre you can take off-road if you have to, with okay grip on-road as a rule. Refinement's also pretty good. This 2-litre diesel is fairly quiet. If we listen, you know, it's still an agricultural thing, but it's definitely minimized and it is quieter than the 5-cylinder unit, but road noise and wind noise are impressively hushed in the Ranger. Now in terms of safety features, we do have forward collision warning, we do have autonomous emergency braking, and we do have lane departure warning that's actually potentially more useful than the active system in the BT-50, because here in the Ranger, you get a wobble through the steering wheel or a vibration through the wheel if you're drifting out of your lane. It's subtle. It doesn't chide the driver in front of the rest of the passengers and beep constantly like the one in the BT-50 does, which I think you're more likely to ignore if it's annoying. The Ranger is more subtle. It corrects your behavior silently through touch. And honestly, I think that's a good way of doing it. We also have a decent reversing camera, but it is in stuff like not having junction AEB or a center airbag that shows that the Ranger is getting on a little bit in terms of years. But when the new vehicle arrives in probably 2022, sharing a platform with the Volkswagen Amarok, it'll be really formidable because this car doesn't feel long in the tooth. So it's interesting when you think that they're actively working on the next generation right now. A couple of other criticisms of the Ranger. Firstly, the fuel consumption does blow out from the claimed figure for the 2-litre. We managed about 9 litres per 100 Ks. And also the rear drum brakes, same with the BT-50, but particularly on the Ranger, which purports to be such a premium ute, it's shocking to see that they haven't changed the rear brakes to discs to match the likes of the Amarok. So that's a detailed comparison of the new Mazda BT-50 with the Ford Ranger Wildtrak 2-litre. I'm keen to know what you reckon, so make sure to leave your comments down below on these two utes and which one you'd have. But for me, it really comes down to what your preferences are. The new BT-50 looks a little bit fresher and more modern to my eyes, and there's no doubt that it packs more adaptive safety technology, plus that interior is bang up to date with technology like wireless Apple CarPlay, and its payload is better on account of it being considerably lighter than the Ranger. However, at actually doing the stuff you're going to do every day in a ute, namely sit in traffic and use it on country roads, the Ranger continues to be a real benchmark in this segment, and to me at least, the dynamics of the Ford Ranger continue to be a cut above the new BT-50 and a cut above most utes on the market. Plus that interior is hardly down market. In some ways it's actually nicer than the new BT-50, and its specs certainly aren't that bad, and if you're a traditionalist, you can keep getting it with the 3.2-litre engine as an option that saves you a bit of money. So for me, it's really hard to decide, but if I had to live with one of these cars every day, honestly, it would be the Ranger Wildtrak. Let me know if you agree. While you're down there in the comments, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.